Welcome back, everybody, to Dungeon Brew. Today, John and I are continuing our conversation on Thieves Guild. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Welcome back, everyone, to Dungeon Brew. John and I are continuing our series on Thieves Guilds, and today we're going to be talking about structures of power within your Thieves Guild, as well as looking at different models you may consider when you're building this out. John and I have built a number of different Thieves Guilds in our own campaigns, and I like to think that we don't ever build any one the same way twice, because having some different intricacies within those Thieves Guilds makes it exciting for our players group. And there's actually a lot of nuance to building a sensible Thieves Guild in regards to how power is structured, how they relate to each other, where your guild masters are, how your different sub-bosses are orchestrated throughout your regions and your world. It's just a whole it's a whole mess of things that go into it when you really want to build this out for your players. So John, where do you want to start in this conversation?
I will say that having the versatility or the changeability within the Thieves Guild also makes it unpredictable on the part of the players, which is nice. Because you don't want your players, especially for DMing for the same group over and over, like we tend to do, that they come in and say, "Oh, well, yeah, I am familiar with this. This is how John always built his Thieves Guilds. They're X, Y, and Z." And that I get bored with that myself, so I can't imagine how a player would feel about that.
So yeah, I would agree with you. I was going to say, I agree with you, and I think that there's a typical way that most DMs approach Thieves Guild, and we mentioned this a little bit in our intro video, that we have like this tendency to, I think, put criminal organizations into like this framework in our minds, especially when we're not criminals ourselves, and so we just create it in a certain way, in this hierarchical way, and think, well, this is just the way that it works, without recognizing there's a lot of different ways to approach it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times it has to do with the goals associated with the criminal network. So I think I'm going to take that direction here first when we start talking about this, is what are the goals of the organization or the people in charge of the organization. And for that, we basically have three different models that we tend to use when we're talking about what those goals happen to be. So one of them is, power, plain and simple. And usually there is one person who is in charge, and that person who is in charge is after certain things. This is your guild master. They have a tendency to have a lot of control over things going on around them, and they may have people underneath them who are keeping control over other aspects of the business as a whole, but ultimately their goal has to do with power more than anything else.
I would agree with that, and I think that's probably what's most familiar to us. Even working in the corporate world, we see things structured as a pyramid, where you have different departments and different groups that are responsible for certain things. And so in a particular Thieves Guild, you're going to have your guild master that's overseeing these individuals over each area of maybe your spies or your thieves or your individuals that are, running the black market, and it's almost sanctioned, and everyone within the guild is working up the hierarchy, looking for more power or more position or more influence within the guild itself. And I think that's probably what is most familiar to us.
Yeah, it's almost kind of like a corporate structure where, you're just waiting for your next promotion and doing more jobs to get promoted, and trying to perform well. And that's, again, I think that this is the typical way that most people view Thieves Guild or a criminal organization in some way, is, you work hard enough and you get moved up the ranks and control and authority, and then eventually you're in power. And even insofar as older Dungeons and Dragons like reference manuals and things like that, when it comes to how a Thieves Guild operates, or even when you are a player seeking to create your own stronghold, you are interested in becoming the guild master at a certain point.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'll be honest, the next type of model is probably my favorite one, just because it speaks to me as an individual, and that's the cultural model. And this is where you have individuals that have shared experiences, maybe shared heritage, shared values, and it's connecting them in one way or another. So maybe you have your halflings that are all part of a Thieves Guild, and they connect with each other because of their commonality among one another. And so you can't really infiltrate this if you're not a halfling, because you don't meet the right standard to be accepted into it. But why I also like it is because it sets you up for some different types of motivations. Instead of power, you may be looking for community and connection among your brethren, your kith and kin, and having that fellowship with one another, but it also sets you up for maybe having a revolutionary type of impact. I like to think of things like, this is kind of a silly reference, but Fight Club, they're coming together to overthrow the financial corporation by bringing all these people to cause disruption in a particular way within the movie. And in their way, they're like their own guild that's doing this through a cultural model where they're not looking for power. They're looking to disrupt power. They're trying to disrupt wealth in a particular way. Oftentimes Robin Hood Men in Tights or Robin Hood in general is the same type of thing.
So the halfling one is a good example, and it's kind of one of the ones that I thought about initially, just in terms of how are things connected, right? For a racially motivated cultural type connection for a thieves guild, they can go into other areas. So it can be district, especially for larger cities where it's like this district, you have to be from it in order to be part of the guild. The people from the next district over are not allowed to be a part of our district or are part of our thieves guild. It makes it very difficult, like you said, for people who are outsiders to gain access, which is one of the strengths of this type of model, is that there's kind of this natural barrier that exists that prevents other people from infiltrating. It also makes it difficult for authorities to get inside of it if they don't have somebody who is connected to whatever it is that drives this model forward. Mm-hmm. So you have things like that, but you also could have things that are more template in nature. So in one of the games we ran, you guys came across a thieves guild that was full of were-rats. So their adoption process might look like, well, if you're not a were-rat, you can't join us. If you really want to join us, we're going to turn you into a were-rat, which is a next level commitment type of a thing. But in terms of like revolutionary, a good version of that would be Star Wars with the revolution that they have. So there is a structure there. There is a hierarchy. Just because it's a cultural model doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't leaders, or there isn't an authority of some kind, that there isn't some kind of power or strength or something else that is driving forward this type of model in that sense.
Yeah, and that's probably why I like this one the most. That value system that ends up being like the power behind it, the driver behind the group itself, I think speaks to those that are playing your game. So if you can find a really strong like type of value system that they promote, your players may be engaged in wanting to support that or reject it if it's nefarious in nature.
So our last model we're going to talk about is the enterprise model. You can also think about this as the economic model, or just a model that basically is money focused. So they're interested in accruing wealth in some way. Many of the guild types we've talked about just kind of naturally gravitate towards this, like the trading company and the black market. They just kind of make sense because it's a good and services type thing. But there's no reason why an enterprise model couldn't include a spy ring if they're selling information, or Assassin's Guild if they're assassins for hire, or anything else like that. And much in the same way as the cultural model, there's no reason there isn't a hierarchy as well. So there can be the hierarchy where it's very rigid and it's structured, and you're trying to get up the ranks and that type of thing. But it also can be a little bit more spread out and a little bit more broad, where it's kind of like a car dealership where you just release all of your sales associates out there, and everyone's just trying to gobble up as much money as they possibly can, and that's really all that's important.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about something that added this specifically, because when I think of models, I do oftentimes just tie these back into motivations, and I feel like these are central motivations, especially from the GM side. When you're putting together a guild, you don't want to complicate it so much to the point that your characters just can't get it at a first glance and kind of understand what's happening for the purpose of the story, until they're kind of infiltrating within that and seeing if there's more to it, or if it's more complex than that. But as we start talking about the different ways of building your structure in regards to this, I think it's important to know that whether they're motivated by this enterprise layout, the cultural layout, or the hierarchical layout, any types of these structures can actually fit into those for the most part. Some are probably more primed. For instance, as we start off here, like the primary way of looking at hierarchy is having that top individual that kind of filters down to all the different, I want to say guild master, that's then filtered down to all of your sub bosses. It's filtered down to some of the people that are, performing the tasks at the very bottom. And so that fits within that hierarchical piece very well. But there's different ways to break that apart.
Right, and I mean, it can be as simple as, the single pyramid, where you have the person up top and it kind of trickles down to the rest of the people within the structure, and ultimately your lower level are the peons, the thralls, the members, whatever you want to call them, that support the rest of the structure overall. But you also have models that are a little bit more spread out, so you might have a central hub or a core group of people who are working together, and then they reach out and pull in people as they need to. And we talked about this a little bit in the guild types, where you have a guild, and that guild pulls in other people, their allies, from time to time if they want to take on a special job. But ultimately, that core group is good at one thing. So it might be something like that cultural model, where it's like people from this district work in this specific way. And every now and again, when outsiders come through, they fold the outsiders into their structure briefly in order to accomplish a goal. And then once they're done with those people, and they kick them back out again, too.
Yeah. I also like to sometimes play with the franchise option, where there's like little it's almost like miniature tents all around my world map, where there are similar hierarchies that all have the same name. So you have your shadow thieves that exist in 6 different towns around the region or around the country, but they're all independent in the way that they function. So you may come into one town and have to get through that hierarchy and defeat the guild master in that particular town. But if you go to the next town over, they too have a franchise of shadow thieves that have adopted the name to have that influence and that calling and be able to instill fear within the enemy. But it's a whole different structure in of itself, and it doesn't have an overall crime lord or guild boss that's overseeing all of these different franchises.
Yeah, so long as they're paying dues to the main guild, the guild that's in charge, it doesn't really matter what it is that they're doing in their own town, because all it does, it benefits the actual shadow thieves in the sense that it makes it seem like they have a much wider reach than they may actually have. And then it also benefits those satellite guilds that are existing around the region, because then it kind of has that same effect where it looks like they're part of this larger structure that you don't want to mess with. So it's a very interesting way of kind of connecting in multiple guilds without having them all be necessarily part of that same like really strong, rigid style hierarchy.
And I'll say that these like concepts we've talked about so far fit really well in that enterprise structure or model, the enterprise model and the hierarchical model. For me, I really get excited when we start talking about other ways of building this, where you have like criminals that are, working. They may identify as they're working for the same organization, but they're kind of independent in how they function, and they only call on each other when needed or when necessary.
Right, yeah, that's one of my favorites actually, is the idea of just a bunch of random thieves that exist in the same town. And so they're not necessarily connected to each other in the sense that there's any hierarchy or there's any guild structure. But if you go into town and you're a thief and you're operating and you're not part of that group, it's like they kind of know who is available and who is a thief in town. And the random adventuring party that comes through and the thief in the party starts doing jobs on their own, the rest of those thieves are going to be like, hey, you're not allowed to work in this area. This is for us. If you want to work on a job, you have to talk to the rest of us first. And so they kind of have this back and forth where they're kind of working in tandem with one another throughout there, but there's nobody who's calling the shots. And I think that that's a very interesting guild dynamic that's not actually a guild.
Yeah, I'll be honest, when I try to relate this back to real world things and things that I've seen in movies and even some forums that I've been a part of, it's almost like your hacker groups. It's like you may have a lot of different really skilled individuals that are, infiltrating networks, obtaining information, selling information, and they know other ones that are within that same area of expertise, but they aren't necessarily working in alignment with each other. They watch each other's back, they call stuff out, they alert the community when there's threats to the community, and they kind of gatekeep their community from others that want to infiltrate it, but they themselves aren't part of a greater organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, is there any other structures that we need to cover?
Trying to think. I'm really interested in hearing from our viewers, honestly, if there are other models that you've used in your own gameplay, other structures that you've kind of developed with your Thieves guilds as you built them. I'm always open to new ideas around this because, as I said, many of us that are GMs have not lived a life of criminal activity prior to playing D&D, and so you kind of have to educate yourself to bring some realism into the game and have some fun with it with your players, without necessarily just trying to give a cookie cutter example that really kind of sometimes serves as game filler and feels a little dry in context.
Yeah, and being creative with both like the goals of the guild and not just keeping it to that, which is either the power hungry or the money greedy, grabby, whatever. Like those I think are both very common ways of looking at the Thieves Guild. I think that cultural model is really kind of interesting and unique. And then staying away from just the rigid hierarchy that is used every single time, I feel like. Which we're going to go through leadership, and we're going to talk about that hierarchy some in the next video. But just the idea of going, what other ways can I structure the guild so that it doesn't feel like it's the same guild every time? Well, maybe there is a group of individuals who are in charge of the guild, and it's almost like a corporation where there's a board of directors, and if the guild master isn't bringing in profits the way that he should, then he gets ousted. Or it's a situation where it's more democratic, and they make decisions as a group and decide how exactly they're going to address different problems that come up in the guild, or they're going to promote within, and things like that. Like, you can get really creative. I would look at our governments video a little bit, or the series that we did there, if you want to get creative with the structure for the way that a Thieves Guild might come together. You can look at gerontocracies, meritocracies, any number of ways of structuring your guild so that it does not feel the same every single time you go through it.
And just one more creative idea that I might throw out there, because we mentioned this a little bit in our intro video about the different types of guilds that you may develop, whether it be spy rings or assassins guilds, black markets, etc. Some of these may be overseen by a shadow government with people that are in charge, that are actually running individuals and giving individual tasks that are not hands-on, but are profiting from it secondhand by the activities that are taking place, and or maybe even keeping citizens underneath a particular type of rule or control through the activities of individuals that aren't aware how their activities are controlling that. So there's a lot of, again, like fun ways to like play with this, where your players are almost like solving a mystery while trying to infiltrate and understand the motivations behind either the individuals that are operating on their own or an organization that's operating in tandem with the government.
Yeah, and you can have a lot of fun with those ideas, especially if you have, even with like nobility, it becomes a mafia style structure where the noble family, Smith, is in charge of the Thieves Guild in this district, and they have been for ages, and they're the ones who are actually in charge of everything, but nobody actually knows that except for maybe a select few people within the guild, because everybody else in the guild thinks that this puppet that they've put in place is the person who's actually in charge, but they're not.
So yeah, once again, I love that, John. Once again, let us know your own ideas, your own creative things that you've done with your guilds, what other models you use, how you guys approach hierarchies. As always, hit that subscribe button, hit the little bell so you know when our next video comes out. And look for our next video when we start talking about the actual power structure and the members that are in the guild. See you guys all next time.
Dungeon Brew.